Asking you that because I was in nursing training already when the war started in 1941 for the Americans. The war had been going on in Europe for a long time until then. And Hitler was going to take over the whole world over there. And they finally, Japan, Pearl Harbor Day was, the 21st or whatever it was of January, and they bombed Pearl Harbor. Well, that brought us into the war. And I was already in nursing school and planned to join the Army when I got out in 43. But this was 1941. And the Army saw prospects for nurses to come in, and they formed a cadet corps. And I was a member of the cadet corps before I joined the Army. But I graduated from nursing school, took my state boards, and qualified to be in the service. And then I went in 44. I got out of training in 43, but I had some time to make up. And I was in the cadet corps during that time. And then it was in name only. I was doing the same thing I had been doing for 3 years. But the cadet corps was just assured the Army that when you graduated and when you passed the boards, you'd come into the Army. Now, and then I was sent to Alabama. I lived in South Carolina. And so I was sent to Alabama for basic training. And while I was there in Alabama, Camp Rucker, Alabama, I was taking basic training. 2 of the nurses in an evac hospital were sent home because they weren't able physically to stand the training, or they didn't like the training or something. They were sent home anyway. And nurses seldom know why people are sent home, but they were sent home. And so I applied for one of those positions in the unit that was training to go overseas. So I said I wanted to go to Europe if possible, and I wanted to replace one of the nurses in the 122nd evac. And I got it. And so that's how I ended up in Europe during the war, was at basic training in Alabama. They sent me from there to New Jersey, and I did overseas training, and which consisted of abandoned ship drill and a lot of things that you wouldn't use unless you were aboard a ship. And we got to Scotland, and we docked way out in the ocean because we went over on the Queen Elizabeth, and it was too big to go into Scotland Harbor. So they ferried us into the harbor. And then we were dispersed to our stations, and I was stationed in Fleetwood, England, and finished my overseas training, and then our unit went to the war. But we left England, went across the Channel in France, the English Channel, and spent some time at Le Havre, and got on the trains. Those trains were so antiquated, but they were horse trains, but they had converted them to travel for nurses and doctors and any personnel that needed a ride from one place to another. It was better than riding in the back of the truck. Because they had big trucks in the Army that had seats on either side of them, and they could get a whole unit in there almost, 40 nurses would fit nicely back there because there were 20 per side. And our unit had 40 nurses, 40 officers, 300 non-commissioned officers, and 3,000 enlisted men. That consisted our unit. And we went over Europe and then finally got in. We spent a week of vacation time in Paris, and then we went on to Paris and Belgium and Germany, and were in the big battle we were in was the Battle of the Bulge, where the Germans broke through the lines. We'd already taken that section of Belgium, the troops had. They fought it and captured it, and then shortly after that, the Germans broke through the lines, and we had to retake it. And that was called the Battle of the Bulge, and it was a very bloody, cold war. I mean, it was very cold temperature-wise, and very cold from the people, because they thought we hadn't done a good job the first time and we were having to do it over. And so they were mad that the war had come back to their country already. And that was in Belgium.
Can you tell me some details about that battle?
The what?
Can you tell me some of your personal experiences in the battle?
In the Battle of the Bulge, we traveled by truck. And we were 5 to 15 miles behind the lines. And we didn't get in the battle, but we cleaned up after one. If the troops were shot up and hurt, we took them to our hospital. And those days we had truck hospitals. They have helicopters now that whisk them right into the evac hospitals. But at the time I was in the service, you had trucks that transported them. And we had enlisted men who loaded them on their truck ambulance. It was an ambulance, but it was a truck originally, and then it brought them into the hospital. And then I worked triage. I don't know if you are familiar with that term or not, but it's a French term, and what it means is the nurse looks at the patient and sees when a convoy of patients come in, you decide if this one needs surgery immediately or if it can wait, if this man can wait for a little while and the one in front of him has the surgery. Because a lot of them was shot abdominally and their intestines and everything were hanging out. You know, their abdomens were just open wide. And they needed surgery right away to put everything back where it belonged.
Can they actually do that and would they survive?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. And that was my job, to select which ones went to surgery, which ones went to the emergency room, which one got treatment right then, and which one they treated in someplace else.
So you pretty much held their lives in your hands. Was
I
that hard?
did, and I was 21 years old. And I had worked at the Cleveland Clinic before I went to service, and I worked there when I came back too. And they thought I was the most well-trained nurse in the unit to do that. So that was my job. It's like a big emergency room where you have 40 patients maybe, and you've got to make that decision. This fella has to go to surgery now. And what you did was you dressed their wound or packed it, or if it were an abdominal wound, you had to pack it because there's a lot of bleeding. And if it wasn't abdominal, if it was the head wound, you packed them in bags, you know, around their heads to keep them immobile. And you sent them off to wherever they needed to go, surgery or to a neuro section of the hospital or someplace where you had to make the decision. They go here, and you mark their foreheads where you were sending them. Like I would mark an S and an M and dressed. And so I would put, they were going to surgery, so I put an S first. Secondly, I put an M for morphine. I'd given them morphine to stop the bleeding. And there, you know, if you give a patient morphine, they immediately stop bleeding because somehow or other the morphine shuts down the bleeders. And they bleed far less if they have a shot of morphine. And then the D was for dressed. And we had dressed every, you know, the head wound, the abdominal wound, whatever. And then you put an initial for that. And then we put them on a stretcher, and someone took them to surgery. And when they got to surgery, the doctor just read what you'd written, and he went looking for that. He looked for the abdominal wounds and the bleeding and everything that you'd marked on the patient's forehead. You didn't have anything else to write on but a patient. And if they had been shot in the head, you couldn't write up on the forehead, so you wrote it on their hands or their arm or wherever you could write, on the skin with like a felt pen. And you just initialed it. You couldn't write long notes. All you could do was just give them a clue of what you'd done. And then working in hospitals is different than being on the battlefield. But evac hospitals are only 5 miles to 15 miles behind the lines. And so you get them pretty fast off the battlefields. Because, and then the troops were burning up bridges behind them, and so they couldn't be followed by the Germans. So a lot of times they'd spend 2 days burning a bridge that the Germans couldn't follow them. And they spent time doing that. Some of them got shot from across the rivers. There are rivers all through Germany. There's a big river, the Rhine River, that goes round through the middle of Germany. But there's a small river that's the R River we were close to, A-R-H. It was the way you spelled it. And they could shoot across the river at you. And so oftentimes we had fire going over our head. And one of the drills you have in the Army is, and nurses have it, all personnel take this drill. And it's called the 3-minute drill, but it takes longer than 3 minutes. And you crawl under ammunition and barbed wire and keep your head down, so they have live ammunition they're shooting over your head. And believe me, you hug the ground when you're going that way, you know. You're moving and you're protecting your head, and even the helmets didn't help. If you got hit, you knew that. You know, you wore a helmet and fatigues and everything to protect yourself. We had a head nurse that said, "These men are hurt. They're not dead, so button your top button on your fatigues." She used to just give us long lectures. You don't lean over a cot, you know, with the top button unbuttoned. And so she gave us long lectures. Now, is that kind of what you want?
Mm-hmm.
Are you recording this?
Yeah.